Kim Hannah stepped off the transport shuttle onto New Geneva Station, her worn canvas bag clutched tightly in her weathered hands. The massive space station buzzed with activity as beings from across the galaxy moved through the corridors. Towering, blue-skinned Malthari warriors stomped past in their heavy combat boots, their forearms carrying enough weapons to outfit a small army. Sleek silver robots glided silently between the crowds, their optical sensors scanning everything with mechanical precision. The elderly Korean woman looked completely out of place among the impressive display of galactic might. Her faded brown sweater had seen better decades, and her grey hair was pulled back in a simple bun secured with what appeared to be a recycled hair tie. She moved slowly, each step deliberate and careful, as if her old bones might give out at any moment. The shooting range occupied an entire section of the station's recreational deck, through the transparent aluminum windows. Hannah could see the stunning view of 3 different star systems twinkling in the void of space. Massive coalition battleships drifted past like metal whales, their hulls bristling with plasma cannons and shield generators inside the range. The atmosphere was thick with competition and testosterone from a dozen different species. A group of 6-legged Centauri mercenaries were placing bets on who could hit targets at the greatest distance. Their chittering language sounded like a mix of clicking insects and grinding metal. Near the advanced weapons rack, a pair of cybernetically enhanced humans were comparing their latest optical implants, their eyes glowing with artificial light as they ran targeting diagnostics. The registration desk sat beneath a massive holographic display showing the day's high scores. At the top of the leaderboard was a name in flowing Altarian script, followed by what appeared to be some kind of tentacle creature's mark. Human names were scattered throughout the lower half of the rankings. Dudley Jesu looked up from his data pad as Hannah approached. The young man couldn't have been more than 25. With the kind of eager expression that suggested he was new to the job. His coalition uniform was crisp and perfectly pressed, probably fresh from the academy. "Welcome to the Galactic Defense Coalition Recreational Firing Range," he said with practiced enthusiasm. Then his expression shifted slightly as he took in her appearance. "First time here, grandmother." He spoke louder than necessary, the way people often did when addressing the elderly, as if age automatically meant hearing problems. Behind him, holographic safety warnings flickered in 17 different languages, showing various alien anatomies and the proper way to handle energy weapons without accidentally vaporizing appendage. Yes, first time," Hannah replied softly, her voice carrying just a hint of her Korean accent. She set her bag down carefully on the counter, wincing slightly as if the movement pained her arthritic joints. Nearby, a group of 5 Malthari soldiers had paused their weapon maintenance to observe the new arrival. These weren't regular coalition troops. Their armor bore the distinctive markings of mercenary units, probably between contracts and looking for entertainment. The largest of them, his blue skin marked with ritual scars, nudged his companion with one of his massive arms. "Look at this," he growled in heavily accented standard galactic. "Another weak human thinks she can play with real weapons." His companions rumbled with what passed for laughter among their species. One of them, a female with intricate silver tattoos covering her arms, shook her head in amusement. "This one looks like she belongs in medical bay, not firing range, probably. Break hip trying to lift plasma rifle," the comments weren't whispered. Malthari culture considered directness a virtue, even when it bordered on cruelty. Several other patrons glanced over, including a table of Vextani traders whose multiple eyes all focused on Hannah simultaneously. Even the cleaning robots seemed to slow their movements, as if their artificial intelligence had been programmed to recognize potentially amusing situations. Jisoo cleared his throat awkwardly, shooting uncomfortable glances at the Malthari group. "The safety protocols are very important," He continued, pulling up a holographic display that showed proper shooting stances, especially for people of your experience level. These aren't the old-style projectile weapons from Earth history. Plasma rifles can be quite powerful, and the recoil compensation systems require a certain amount of physical strength too. I understand. Hannah interrupted gently, her trembling hands already reaching for the registration pad. Just the basic equipment, please, and the beginner's course. Her signature was barely legible. Just shaky lines that could have belonged to anyone. The stylus seemed almost too heavy for her grip, and she had to steady her right hand with her left to complete the forms. When she reached the section asking about previous weapons experience, she marked the box labeled none without hesitation. Jisoo processed her payment, a modest amount that suggested she was probably living on a fixed pension, and handed her a basic safety packet along with a temporary range pass. The holographic ID photo made her look even more fragile than she appeared in person. Lane 15 is available, he said, pointing toward the far end of the range. That's our quieter section. Better for beginners. Hannah made her way to lane 15, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the polished metal floor. The firing range stretched out before her like a technological cathedral, with energy barriers humming softly between each shooting position. Holographic targets flickered to life at various distances, some shape like standard bullseyes while others resembled the silhouettes of different alien combat forms used in military training. The basic plasma rifle felt awkward in her hands as she lifted it from the equipment rack. The weapon was sleek and modern, its surface covered in touch-sensitive controls that glowed with soft blue light, unlike the heavy projectile weapons of old Earth. This rifle was designed to be lightweight and user-friendly, perfect for recreational shooters and beginners. Park Min-ho, the range safety officer, approached her position with a friendly smile. He was a middle-aged Korean man with graying temples and the patient demeanor of someone who had spent years teaching nervous civilians how to handle weapons safely. His coalition uniform bore the patches of multiple training certifications. First time with energy weapons, he asked, checking that her safety gear was properly adjusted. The protective glasses and hearing dampeners were standard issue, designed to work with multiple species anatomy. Yes, Hannah replied, her voice barely audible over the sounds of other shooters. Down the line, a Zentari mercenary was testing what looked like a miniature cannon, each shot creating brilliant flashes of orange energy that lit up the entire range. Minho helped her adjust the rifle settings to the lowest power level. Just squeeze gently, he instructed. The targeting computer will help with basic aim correction. Don't worry about hitting the center right away. Most people need weeks of practice. Hannah nodded and raised the weapon, her movements cautious and uncertain. The rifle wavered in her grip as she tried to line up the sights with the nearest target, set at just 20 meters away. Her breathing was uneven, and her hands shook with what appeared to be nervous tension. The first shot went wide, striking the barrier wall in a shower of harmless sparks. The second shot hit the outer edge of the target area, barely qualifying as a hit. By the third attempt, word had spread among the other shooters that there was entertainment to be had. Watch this, called out the largest Malthai warrior, his voice booming across the range. Human grandmother thinks she's a soldier. His companions abandoned their own practice sessions to gather round, their forearms crossed in amusement. The female with silver tattoos pointed one of her massive fingers in Hannah's direction. Look how she shakes. Maybe she needs walking stick instead of rifle. Their laughter was deep and rumbling, like distant thunder. Other patrons began to notice the commotion. A group of sleek Forthan pilots, their elongated skulls gleaming under the range lights, paused their conversation to observe. Even the automated maintenance drones seemed to hover nearby, their sensors recording what their programming might have classified as unusual behavior patterns. Hannah's fourth shot missed the target entirely, striking the wall somewhere behind. The holographic display, a few beings actually applauded sarcastically, as if watching a particularly amusing comedy performance. The Malfari leader cupped his hands round his mouth and shouted loud enough for half the range. To hear, maybe. Humans should try flower ranging instead. Much safer for everyone. The crowd grew larger as word spread through the station's social networks. Beings who had been shopping or dining elsewhere began filtering in to witness what was being described as the worst shooting. Displaying coalition history. Some were even placing bets on whether the elderly human would manage to hit the target at all. Hannah lowered the rifle, her shoulders sagging with apparent defeat. She looked round at the gathered crowd, her eyes meeting the amused stares of dozens of different species. For a moment, she seemed overwhelmed by the attention, like any normal person would be when made the center of public ridicule. "Excuse me," she said quietly to Minho, her voice so soft he had to lean closer to hear her over the noise. "Could I perhaps try one of those advanced rifles, just to see if there's a difference?" Minho looked surprised by the request. "Ma'am, those are military-grade weapons. They're much heavier and more complex. If you're having trouble with the basic model, please," Hannah interrupted gently. "I'd like to understand why my shots aren't going where I aim them." The range officer shrugged, probably figuring that a few more missed shots wouldn't make the situation any worse. He walked over to the advanced weapons rack and selected a pulse cannon typically used by Coalition Special Forces. The weapon was easily twice the weight of the basic rifle, its surface covered in tactical modifications and precision components. As Minho handed her the military weapon, something extraordinary happened. The moment Hannah's fingers wrapped around the grip, her entire demeanor shifted. The trembling in her hands stopped completely. Her stance became solid and balanced, feet positioned exactly shoulder-width apart. Her breathing slowed to a steady, controlled rhythm. The crowd fell silent as they watched the transformation. Even the Malfari warriors stopped their commentary. Sensing that something had changed, Hannah raised the pulse cannon with movements that were suddenly fluid and precise, like a master craftsman picking up a familiar tool. The targeting computer in the advanced weapon began calculating distance, wind factors, and energy dispersal patterns. But Hannah wasn't looking at the digital displays. Her focus was entirely on the target, her eyes narrowing with the kind of concentration that spoke of years of practice. The first shot from the pulse cannon struck dead center with surgical precision. The second shot followed the first with mechanical precision, striking the target so close to the original hole that the holographic display had to magnify the image to show two separate impact points. The third shot landed between them, creating a triangle so small it could have been covered by a coin. The fourth and fifth shots completed what military experts call the shadow formation, 5 rounds clustered within a space no larger than a child's fingertip. Retired Coalition Commander Choi Dae-ho had been enjoying his afternoon coffee at the Ranger's observation deck, catching up with old war stories with a few fellow veterans. The steaming cup was halfway to his lips when the target display caught his attention. The liquid splashed across his uniform as the cup tumbled from nerveless fingers, but he didn't notice. His eyes were fixed on the impossible grouping showing on the main screen. "Dear God," he whispered, his face going pale beneath his graying beard. "That's the shadow formation." Round him, the casual conversation died as other retired officers followed his gaze. Colonel Kimbora, a decorated veteran of the Outer Rim campaigns, leaned forward in her chair, her cybernetic eye word as it focused on the display, running calculations that her organic brain couldn't process fast enough. "Dae-ho, what are you talking about?" she asked, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty. She had seen that pattern before, in classified military files and training manuals that were restricted to only the highest levels of command down on the firing line. Hannah continued shooting with movements that seemed almost mechanical in their perfection. Each shot followed the same ritual. A slow, controlled breath, a moment of absolute stillness, then the gentle squeeze of the trigger, the pulse cannon, which should have been difficult for someone her size to control, remained rock steady. In her grip, the crowd of spectators had grown silent, their earlier amusement replaced by something approaching awe. The Malthari warriors who had been making jokes minutes before now stood with their forearms at their sides, their warrior instincts recognizing something they couldn't quite name. Even their leader, scarred from a dozen battles across the galaxy, found himself studying the elderly woman with no eyes in the observation deck. More veterans were gathering round Choi's table. Word was spreading through the station's veteran network. Something extraordinary was happening at the shooting range. A grizzled Zentari colonel clicked his way over, his 6 legs carrying him with surprising grace despite his advanced age. Commander Choi, the insectoid veteran said in his clicking language, with the station's translators converted to standard galactic. My sensors detect elevated stress levels in this area. What has caused this disturbance? Choi pointed at the target display with a shaking finger. Look at that grouping. Clacks. Tell me what you see. The Zentari's compound eyes focused on the screen, his antennae twitching as he processed the information. His species had some of the best natural vision in the galaxy, able to detect minute details that other beings would miss. After a moment, his entire body went rigid. Impossible. He clicked rapidly. That is the signature of the Ghost Sniper. But the Ghost died in the Titan Station siege 30 years ago. Down below. Veterans throughout the crowd were beginning to make similar connections. They studied Hannah with the trained eyes of soldiers who had learned to notice details that could mean the difference between life and death. Her age fit the timeline perfectly. If the Ghost had survived the war, she would be in her late 70s now. The way she moved, even when pretending to be frail, showed muscle memory that took decades to develop. Captain Yoon Ji-hye, the former intelligence officer, pulled up classified files on her personal data pad. Her clearance level was still high enough to access certain historical records, and what she found made her blood run cold. The official report listed Lieutenant Colonel Kim Hannah as missing in action, presumed dead, after the final battle of Titan Station. But there had always been whispers, rumors that the Ghost had survived and simply vanished into civilian life. The height matches, Ji-hye whispered to her companion. The age is right. And look at how she's standing. That's not the posture of a recreational shooter. The observation deck was filling with more people as word continued to spread. Some came out of curiosity. Others because they were veterans who understood the significance of what they were witnessing. The station's AI systems had automatically flagged the unusual gathering, sending alerts to security personnel who arrived to find a crowd of former soldiers staring in. Stunned silence at an elderly woman with a rifle on the firing line. Hannah paused between shots to adjust her grip. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it revealed something that made several veterans gasp. Her left hand showed the faint outline of a scar that ran from her wrist to her palm, the distinct mark left by an exploding Zephyrian plasma grenade, an injury that had been detailed in the Ghost's classified medical records. The whisper started somewhere in the back of the crowd, spoken so quietly that it was barely audible over the hum of the ranger's ventilation systems. But in the silence that had fallen over the area, every word carried like a prayer. The Ghost of Titan Station. Hannah's hand froze on the weapon's grip for just a moment. Her carefully maintained facade cracked, and something cold and dangerous flickered in her eyes. She had heard the name. and the decades of peaceful retirement couldn't completely hide the soldier who had once been the Coalition's most feared sniper. The recognition spread through the crowd like wildfire, passed from person to person in a dozen different languages. Veterans who had served in battles across the galaxy found themselves in the presence of a legend they had thought was lost to history. The elderly woman they had watched struggle with a basic rifle was none other than the Ghost, the sniper who had single-handedly changed the course of the war. The pulse cannon felt heavier in Hannah's hands as she slowly placed it back on the weapon rack. The weight seemed to carry more than just metal and circuitry. It held the burden of memories she had spent 3 decades trying to bury. The crowd behind her had grown to nearly 100 beings, their breathing the only sound in the suddenly quiet range. She turned around with deliberate slowness, her movements no longer showing any trace of the frail elderly woman who had shuffled in an hour ago. Her back was straight, her shoulders squared, and when she looked up at the assembled crowd, her eyes held the steady gaze of someone who had stared death in the face and walked away. "My name is Lieutenant Colonel Kim Hannah," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Gone was the soft, trembling tone of an old grandmother. This voice belonged to someone who had commanded respect on battlefields across the galaxy. Coalition Special Forces, Sniper Division, retired. Serial number 7-7-Alpha-9-2-6. The formal identification sent to shiver through the veterans in the crowd. Those numbers were legendary in military circles, associated with combat records that were still classified at the highest levels. Commander Choi felt his knees go weak as the reality hit him. He was standing in the presence of the most decorated sniper in Coalition history. "Though most of you probably knew me by a different name," Hannah continued, her gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. Humans, Malthori, Centauri, Vorthan, and dozens of other species all stared back at her with expressions ranging from awe to disbelief. Captain Yoon Ji-hye was frantically scrolling through classified files on her data pad, her security clearance allowing her access to records that most people would never see. The images she found matched perfectly. A younger Kim Hannah in full combat gear, her rifle scope reflecting the light of alien suns as she took positions that had become legendary. "The Ghost," whispered a voice from the crowd. This time it wasn't spoken in hushed reverence, but with the certainty of confirmed truth. Hannah nodded slowly. "That's what they call me. The Ghost of Titan Station, the Shadow Sniper, the Phantom of the Outer Rim." Each title carried weight, representing campaigns and battles that had shaped the course of galactic history. 1,247 confirmed kills across 15 war zones. 17 different species of hostile forces engaged and neutralized. The numbers hit the crowd like physical blows. Even the most experienced veterans had never achieved kill counts that high. The Malthari warriors, whose culture prized martial prowess above all else, found themselves looking at someone whose combat record dwarfed their own achievements. In the observation deck, retired officers were pulling up historical battle records on their personal devices. The siege of Titan Station had been taught in military academies for 30 years, but always with the understanding that the key figure, the sniper who had held the evacuation route, had died in the final assault. The official records showed Lieutenant Colonel Kim Hannah as missing in action, presumed killed when the station's main reactor exploded. "I disappeared after the war," Hannah continued, her voice taking on a weary quality that spoke of old pain. "The Coalition needed a hero's death more than they needed a broken soldier. So I let them declare me dead. Let them build monuments and WRITE stories about the ghost who gave her life for the cause." She walked slowly through the crowd, which parted before her like water. Beings who commanded respect throughout the galaxy stepped aside for the small, elderly woman whose reputation had grown to mythical proportions during her supposed death. "I spent 30 years on a farming colony in the Kepler system," she said, stopping in front of a holographic display that showed images from various coalition victories. Her own face appeared in several of the photos, though much younger and wearing the grim expression of someone who had seen too much war, growing tomatoes and carrots, tending to wounded animals, trying to forget what these hands had done. She held up her weathered hands, and several veterans could now clearly see the scars that marked them, burns from plasma backwatch, cuts from shrapnel, and the distinctive calluses that came from decades of handling precision weapons. These weren't the soft hands of a retired civilian. They belonged to a warrior, the largest. Malvari warrior, the one who had been loudest in his mockery earlier, stepped forward from his group. His forearms moved in a complex gesture that was recognized throughout the galaxy as a sign of ultimate respect among his people. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, "Ghost Sniper." He said in heavily accented standard, "My battalion fought in the Rigel campaigns. We heard the stories. How you held the bridge at Omega-7 for 6 hours against impossible odds. How you saved the 14th Fleet with shots that traveled across 3 kilometers of space." Hannah's expression softened slightly as she looked at the massive warrior. "The Rigel campaigns," she repeated. "I remember. Your people fought with honor there. Many good soldiers died on both sides." Other veterans began stepping forward, sharing their own memories and connections to the Ghost's legendary service record. A Zentari colonel spoke of how her precision strikes had allowed his unit to evacuate civilians from a burning space station. A human captain recalled studying her techniques at the academy, never knowing he might someday meet the legend herself. "But some things," Hannah said, glancing back at the target that still displayed her perfect grouping, "you never really forget. Muscle memory doesn't fade, even when you want it to. The ability to read wind patterns and calculate trajectory adjustments. It stays with you like an old song you can't get out of your head." The crowd listened in complete silence as she spoke about the weight of her service, the cost of being the Coalition's most effective killer, and the choice she had made to disappear rather than continue living as a weapon pointed at the galaxy's enemies. The moment of quiet reflection shattered as emergency sirens began wailing throughout New Geneva Station. Red warning lights bathed the shooting range in an ominous glow, and the automated voice of the station's AI system echoed through the corridors in 17 different languages. "Alert, alert. Hostile forces detected. All civilian personnel report to designated evacuation zones immediately." Commander Choi's personal communicator burst to life with urgent chatter from the station's command center. His face went pale as he listened to the rapid-fire reports coming through the encrypted channel. "Zephyrian raiders," he announced to the crowd, his military training taking over despite his retirement. "Outer perimeter breached. They're moving fast. Looks like a full assault formation." Through the transparent aluminum windows of the range, distant explosions lit up the darkness of space like deadly fireworks. The approaching enemy ships were visible now, their distinctive angular hulls cutting through the void with predatory grace. Zephyrian raiders were known throughout the galaxy for their brutality and their refusal to take prisoners. "All civilians to evacuation pods," Choi continued, but his communicator crackled with bad news before he could finish the order. "Sir, evacuation impossible." Came the voice of Lieutenant Park from the command center. Static filled the transmission, as enemy jamming systems interfered with their communications. "They're blocking all escape routes. Coalition response fleet is still 40 minutes out. Our defense systems are... We're overwhelmed." "Sir..." The crowd began to panic as the reality of their situation sank in. Families with children pushed toward the exits, while veterans instinctively began looking for weapons and defensive positions. The Malvari warriors were already moving toward the advanced weapons rack, their forearms working to grab as much firepower as they could carry. Outside the windows, the first wave of Zephyrian fighters screamed past the station, their energy weapons leaving glowing trails in the darkness. The station's defensive turrets returned fire, but they were clearly outgunned. Explosions rocked the outer hull, causing the lights to flicker and the artificial gravity to fluctuate. In the midst of the chaos, Hannah stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the approaching enemy fleet. She watched their formation with the analytical gaze of someone who had spent decades studying how to kill things that moved through space. Her fingers unconsciously tapped against her leg as she calculated distances, approach vectors, and weak points in their attack pattern. The main assault ships are hanging back, she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. Smart. They're letting the fighters test our defenses first. She turned to look at the terrified faces round her, civilians who had come to the range for recreation, now trapped in what was about to become a war zone. Children clung to their parents, while elderly beings struggled to understand what was happening. The Zentari colonel was trying to organize some kind of defense, but they had no real weapons and nowhere to run. Hannah's gaze moved to the advanced weapons display, where the most sophisticated firearms in the galaxy were mounted behind transparent security barriers. Her eyes lingered on a particular rifle, a long-range precision weapon designed for ship-to-ship combat at extreme distances. She sighed deeply, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of 30 years of peaceful retirement. Then, with deliberate movements, she began removing her faded brown sweater. Underneath, her arms were revealed for the first time. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Her skin was marked with faded military tattoos that told the story of her service. The Ghost Battalion insignia on her right shoulder, campaign ribbons that represented battles across a dozen star systems, and most notably, a series of small marks running down her left forearm, one for every 100 confirmed kills. A tradition among coalition snipers that few ever spoke about openly. Minho, she called to the range officer, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. I need your best long-range rifle. The Kruger Mark 7 if you have one, and all the ammunition you can spare, Park. Minho looked between her and the weapons display, his hands shaking as another explosion rocked the station. Mom, those are restricted military weapons. I can't just override code Alpha 77 Delta. Hannah interrupted, reciting a sequence that made Minho's eyes widen. Those were Ghost Protocol clearance codes, supposedly lost with the legendary sniper's death 30 years ago. The security barriers round the advanced weapons deactivated with a soft hiss. Hannah moved to the display with practiced efficiency, her hands selecting components with the speed of someone who had assembled sniper rifles in combat conditions. She paired the main weapon with a specialized scope designed for space combat, added a gyroscopic stabilizer to compensate for the station's rotation, and loaded it with armor-piercing rounds designed to penetrate ship hulls. Ma'am, you don't have to do this, Commander Choi said, stepping forward with obvious concern. You've done enough for the galaxy. More than enough. This isn't your fight anymore. Hannah looked up at him as she shouldered the completed weapon, and for a moment, her expression softened with something that might have been gratitude. Yes, I do, she replied simply. These people came here for a peaceful day at the range. They deserve to go home to their families. She began walking toward the observation deck, which offered the best view of the approaching enemy fleet. The crowd parted before her, and several veterans fell into step behind her, forming an impromptu honor guard for the legendary sniper, time to remind them why humanity earned its place in this galaxy. She said, taking position at the largest viewport. The enemy ships were clearly visible now, their weapons charging for what would probably be the final assault on the station's weakened defenses. Hannah knelt by the window and extended the rifle's bipod, settling into a shooting position that was as natural to her as breathing. Her scope tracked across the enemy formation until it found what she was looking for, the command ship, larger than the others and positioned at the center of their attack formation. Some things. She murmured, her finger finding the trigger, are worth coming out of retirement for. The distinctive crack of the precision rifle echoed through the observation deck as Kim Hannah, the ghost of Titan Station, returned to war one final time. The end.